What do you see throughout history? The great leaders almost always come out of a community of friendship.
What we play out on the micro level in our own lives, in our own relationships, is the same pattern that's being played out at the highest level.
You see the seeds of destruction there in the center.
Just having a conversation like this, I think that spiral goes both ways, right? Like you can go up. Hello and welcome. I'm excited to get to be with you here today, and I'm actually especially excited because we have a particularly special episode today, and that is our very first guest conversation that we've had. And so I'm excited to get to introduce our guest today, who is a very dear and old friend of mine. And as well, he's an educator and a speaker and writer, and he's also a super smart guy with a doctorate in political philosophy from Hillsdale College in Michigan. And of course, most specifically, as I say, he is a lifelong friend. And so just really excited and happy to get to have him here with us. And so without further ado, so allow me to introduce Dr. Nathan Gill. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to be here. I'll try to live up to the introduction. Super smart guy. Oh, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I guess yeah, I guess we'll see how it goes. But it is, yeah, it's just great to get to have you. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and to, as I say, be our first guest, because I thought it would be especially fitting that we do that because you and I have been having these kinds of conversations, I feel like, for as long as I can remember. I mean, like decades. We've been friends for a long, long time. As I say, in a lot of ways, we've been friends really basically since we were born. And we've talked about this and kind of joked about our moms were friends even before we were born. So we kind of guessed that we hypothesized that there might have been some sort of telepathic communication going on even pre-birth. And so we've been having these conversations even before we were born, possibly, at least in a spiritual sense. So I'm hoping that we can kind of just already sort of just challenge, is that we can kind of channel some of the energy that we normally have in our conversations into this format, just at a just slightly more public sense. So I'm hoping that we can do that, and it's always a lot of fun. We always have a lot of fun with these conversations. We haven't been able to have them quite as frequently lately, just because life gets a little bit crazy. We were talking about that earlier, just with family and work and all of that. But
Yeah, I
but it's
remember. Yeah, no, I remember conversations on these kinds of things for a long time. I remember probably when we were like 12 or 13, I remember the very late night conversations meandering over philosophical topics, including friendship, which I know is one of the things we're going to touch on this in this episode. But I remember friendship being one of the earliest subjects that we were interested in because of how we saw friends kind of changing as we hit those teenage years.
It's so true. Yeah, it is so true. And I remember too those conversations, those late night teenage conversations. Those are kind of it's kind of the
Classic.
peak. Yeah, the classic. It's the kind of the peak of the mountain or the bottom of the valley, depending on how it goes. We're never really sure. That late at night, it kind of just goes where it's going to go. But I also remember, yeah, thinking about at that age, looking sort of ahead and looking at even our parents and people that were older than us, and looking at just how difficult it seems to be as you get older to be able to maintain friendships and to continue to have those kinds of friendships as you go forward into life, having kids and moving sometimes from state to state or place to place. And so it could be a real challenge. And I remember reflecting on that as kids and being like, wow, we got to really try to make sure that we stay friends. So I'm thankful that we've been able to in some way accomplish that. And so, but I just wanted before we get into that, so we're going to talk about those things here in just a little bit, some more. But before we do, I just want to set the table just a bit for what we're going to be talking about. And so I'll just take a few minutes to do that, and then maybe kind of give us a couple of things that we can springboard off of as we continue the conversation. And that is, we've been thinking here a little bit about the symbolism of the kind of the seafaring story. We've been talking a little bit about some of the great seafaring tales and the imagery of ships and the imagery of the sea, and sort of how the imagery of the sea is mythologically symbolic for the unpredictability of the world and the kind of unformed potential of the world on which we ourselves sail, and how that is constantly something that we have to be navigating. And that there are certain times, it seems, in life where we experience more of that. There's kind of like the idea of like the floodwaters, they start to rise. Life becomes more chaotic, right? There's a greater sense of that kind of unpredictability that comes up in our lives and in culture as well. We see this in some of the stories, like in the flood narrative in Genesis. We see this in the biblical accounts. And the question then becomes, it's like, what do you do? Like, what do you do when the waters are rising, or when things get choppy, or there's storms that arise and all those kinds of things? How do we navigate all of that? What do we do in order to stay afloat in all of that? And the suggestion in a lot of these great stories is basically, it's a simple one, but it's the idea of building a boat, right? That you build a ship. In the story of the flood, there Noah builds the ark. In some of the other great myths, we see stories like the story of Odysseus and the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and this idea of building a vessel that will carry us through the adventure, that will be able to take us through, all of the different perils and monsters and the things that we kind of encounter there. And so I think that symbolically, that this is something that we can latch onto, and that can be very helpful for us as we experience those times in our own lives, as we experience these times even culturally. I think even culturally here in the West, that we're experiencing a time where there is a really pronounced sense of kind of floodwaters and some measure of chaos and all those kinds of things. And so it's like, what can we do? How do we best navigate that? And so what I thought we'd like to talk about here a little bit more today is to sort of drill down a bit more into kind of the practical sense of this, of like, what does shipbuilding look like? What does it mean to have a vessel that can carry us through that, and to build these kinds of vessels and to maintain these things so that we can navigate the world that so many times throws all kinds of things at us that we're not necessarily expecting, and that we don't necessarily know where that's coming from. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and we'll get to maybe some of the ideas that we might be able to throw back and forth on that. But I did want to start with this idea of friendship. I thought that that would be a very fitting place, as we've already talked about a bit. We have been friends for a very long time, and so I wanted to maybe springboard into this by talking about the idea of friendship as a vessel, this idea of community, and this idea of connection, and how specifically friendship in terms of relationship is something that can help us to navigate the world, that can stay with us even through the various twists and turns. I know in our own lives we've had, lots of different changes and things happen over the years. And so I thought we could just talk a little bit about that, maybe more broadly about how friendship can do that for us, and then even specifically, even some reflections from maybe our own friendship. What are some ways in which we've found ourselves, what has been helpful to us in keeping the boat of friendship afloat over the years? How have we been able to kind of navigate some of those different seasons of life, and then maybe how that applies more kind of broadly to this idea of relationship, friendship, community as something to help us to navigate the world. So that's a whole bunch of thoughts there that I'm just throwing out there to you. But I don't know if any of that kind of maybe rings a bell for you. What are maybe some thoughts about friendship, or even our friendship more specifically, that come to mind
Hmm.
for you?
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. And as you're talking, there's so many avenues to go down in response to that, because as somebody who's studied history, even though my advanced degrees in political philosophy, a lot of my time there and before was studying history. And it's really history that animates me the most. And what do you see throughout history? You see the great leaders, the people who define moments, eras, nations, even epochs. They almost always come out of a community of friendship.
Mm,
I mean, the examples are just limitless. My mind goes to obviously the Inklings, of course, the revolution in imaginative Christian writing and how I just finished That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. And at the end of my edition of That Hideous Strength, which by the way, the host of this podcast illustrated for me, we have a beautiful dust jacket with a custom painting showing the story of the three books of the space trilogy. Um, but at the very end of this edition, there's a letter on the last page where Tolkien, in one of his rare moments of candor about the good things about Lewis, Tolkien says in a letter that I think he wrote to some like academic publication that had to do with philology or something, but he was talking about Lewis's influence on him, and he said something like, "My debt to Lewis is immense." I wish I had it and I could just read it, but he said something like, "My debt to Lewis is immense, not in terms of influence as that is normally understood, but in terms of encouragement."
mm.
He essentially says, without Lewis's encouragement, I would not have finished writing the Lord of the Rings series, and it never would have been published.
Wow.
And I thought that was pretty remarkable because usually Tolkien is pretty dour and keeps his personal thoughts about the virtues of Lewis and his other friends pretty close to the chest. But here was a moment where he credited Lewis's encouragement um, with being responsible for the Lord of the Rings seeing publication. So I thought that was
Wow.
pretty incredible. So you have the Inklings, which launches Tolkien and Lewis, as well as Barfield and others, into the public consciousness. But then if you go throughout history, I mean, you just constantly run into the same thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that you bring up Tolkien and Lewis there, because I know, for the two of us, we've been both very influenced by their writings. They're some of our favorite writers. I know I remember, again, as teenagers, I remember getting the honor of introducing you to the world of Middle Earth, and then we spent a whole lot of time there, especially with the films, and I remember having movie marathons where we would watch those
Oh
movies,
yeah.
and of course many readings and rereadings of those stories, and then of course Lewis as well, both his fantasy with the Chronicles of Narnia, and then just his incredible versatility as a storyteller, being able to navigate that kind of world of fantasy and really pioneering that world, and then also, as you were talking about, the space trilogy, science fiction, and then myths retold. That was a major thing for both Tolkien and Lewis, was the idea of being able to go back to some of the ancient myths and retell them in new and different ways, which both of them did. And then also there, especially with Lewis, his more nonfiction writing as well, his more philosophical and kind of didactic sorts of writing have been really formational for each of us. And I think it is interesting because right at the center of all of that is that friendship, this kind of famous friendship between Tolkien and Lewis, these giants, literary giants, right, and scholarly giants as well. And they had a lot of, I know, a lot of influence on us, but it's interesting to reflect on how different they were, that they were two very different kinds of people, and yet they were able to support one another over many, many years, and were really very instrumental in the creative process for one another. You talked about the Inklings group, this kind of group of friends that were just this literary society, essentially an informal literary society, where they would just get together, read their writings to one another, critique one another sometimes mercilessly, or I shouldn't say mercilessly, but quite quite strongly at times, but also at the same time, as you were saying, this idea of encouragement. And I think about just in terms of our own friendship and some of the things that we've found over the years to be especially instrumental there. I think are kind of those two sides. You see sort of those two sides of friendship, like the idea of encouragement on the one side, of being able to be the support and to be there for one another. I know you and I have been through some various times of our lives that have been more challenging. And I know for me personally, one of the things I've most appreciated about our relationship is just always being, your presence there and just being able to be like, hey, there's somebody that I can go to, there's somebody that I can talk to, that I can kind of divulge, whatever it is that's going on, and look to be that sort of sense of stability, that sort of pillar to be able to lean on. But then at the same time, too, there's the other side of it as well, that you and I, kind of like Tolkien and Lewis, like we have a lot of similarities between the two of us. We think in very similar ways in some respects, but then we're very different in others as well. Especially like you were talking about, political philosophy is not something that I'm especially interested in. You were mentioning like I'm also an artist, so I tend to be a little bit more on the chaotic side, and I think that you tend to be a little bit more on the ordered sort of side of things and the kind of interplay between those things. But I think it's also that interplay between those differences that keeps friendship dynamic, that is what actually gives it some of its resiliency and gives it some of its value. Because I know even just over the years, like one of the things, in addition to encouragement, like with the Inklings, one of the things that I have so appreciated about our friendship is just being able to even go to you in terms of like as a sounding board. It's like, here's somebody who's different from me, who sees the world in sometimes very differently from me, that I can kind of bring my ideas to or experiences to or whatever, and know that I'm not just going to get that kind of pat on the back encouragement, but also like, here's a different way of looking at things, and here are, sometimes even brutally honest kind of thoughts about that. So I think that kind of having those two sides together is a really instrumental aspect to friendship.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's hard to know which path to pursue here, but yeah, no, Lewis and Tolkien strikingly different. It's always this letter that I paraphrased from Tolkien really stood out to me because normally when I hear him talk about Lewis, it's more that brutally honest category.
Yeah, yeah.
Tolkien did not think highly of Lewis's poetry.
Hmm.
Tolkien was not sure what he thought of Lewis's use of allegory. And yet they had this mutual admiration and encouragement for each other. You see that in Lewis with the discarded image. You see that in Tolkien with trying to recover this medieval, even Anglo-Saxon way of seeing the world and writing a myth for Middle-earth, the Middle-earth that we live in. Um, Interesting to see, even in that hideous strength. This is my first time reading it, but how Lewis is kind of doing the same thing there and like connecting the Arthurian legends to the history of our actual world that we live in.
Hmm.
Um, with the idea of logos and the poetic and how the poetic keeps resurfacing. You have two Englands, an England that um, knows itself through the poetic, and then the England that's like rationalistic and negative,
Yeah, yeah,
threatening
yeah.
it. So, anyway, all that to say, very different temperaments, very different
Hmm.
um, directions they took that, but nevertheless, you can see this incredible and even vast like commonality that their works share.
Yeah,
It's pretty neat
absolutely.
stuff.
And it's interesting too, because even as you were talking about some of their writings specifically, I think again we see this sort of duality kind of emerging there, and I think it does come back to this idea. So this idea of the chaotic kind of aspect of the world, that there's this idea of this sort of underlying potentiality, chaos, kind of ever changingness, ever shiftingness to the world. But then there's this idea of the ship that sails along on the surface of that and is sort of a container for order and is a container um, for life itself, or actually really life is kind of the interplay between those two things. It's like the order that is good, that can navigate the surface of that, and then the sort of this unpredictable kind of chaotic element kind of underneath. And I think that we see that in the relationship Well, I think we see it in relationships kind of generally between people. And I think we see it in the relationship even between Tolkien and Lewis, where like one of the things that's very different about them is I think that Lewis as I think that Lewis is a slightly more, he has a little bit more of that aspect of the kind of free flowing. And I don't want to say that Lewis was chaotic because Lewis was very orderly in his thoughts and he was eminently logical and all the rest. But he also had, he had sort of an aspect to him that was a little bit more maybe kind of free flowing. I think that Tolkien had it too in a lot of ways. You see it in Tolkien's art as well as some of his paintings. But I think his was a bit more structured. And so I think that that's sometimes where they would rub against each other a little bit. And I think we also see it kind of surface in their writing as well. Like you were talking about in That Hideous Strength by Lewis, we see as you were saying, kind of this collision and this interplay between the natural world, the kind of chaotic, this idea that the world of Merlin, the world of nature, the world of the sort of primordial kind of ancient world that is sort of like morally ambiguous. It has this kind of weirdness to it that and then we see the kind of idea of order and modernity being kind of juxtaposed against that, and we see the idea of kind of two different kinds of order coming out of that. We see the idea, kind of like the dark, sort of the dark tower, if you will, kind of version of that, the kind of order that wants to like subdue and control and dominate the world. And then Lewis juxtaposes this in That Hideous Strength to the idea of like what a kind of like actually healthy community looks like that doesn't subdue the world and doesn't subdue nature, but rather that it connects to nature and sublimates nature in some ways and kind of reaches down into the chaos and brings it up. And I think that that is really the analogy for what we are trying to do in the world, and the idea of a ship, that a ship is not something that is just, it's not a monolith. It's not just something that is kind of planted in the ground, in cement, in stone, whatever, this kind of tower that just wants to control everything. But rather the idea of the ship has this ability to kind of navigate and be flexible and move through all of that. Yeah, so I'm just thinking about that when it comes to the idea of stories and the idea of the world. I know we were going to talk a little bit too. You had mentioned a thought that you were had in mind when it comes to the idea of we're talking about the idea of wilderness, the idea of nature, the idea of this way of seeing the world that is sort of the interplay between civilization, kind of people going and cultivating the world and exploring the world and building these kinds of places and communities and sort of carving out these spaces. And then there's like the wilderness that's sort of at the edge of those things.
Hmm.
In the stories and stories, a lot of times it's like the forest, right? There's the forest, the dark forest, the wilderness, that which is kind of on the edge. And I think that this is sort of an interesting, similar analogy to the world and to the idea of seafaring, which is like kind of the different ways of connecting with and navigating the wilderness and nature, and the fact that the world is always kind of encroaching, that there's always this sort of like thing that's kind of underneath this idea of like nature that's sort of wanting to come up, and the need to kind of push that back sometimes and create a space and create order, but then other times too, like to be able to work with nature and to work
Right.
with the more chaotic aspects of life. So I know there's a bunch of thoughts there. I don't know if that triggers anything for
Yeah,
you.
yeah, for sure. There's a couple things that come to mind from that. I'm thinking of my experience as an educator. I was full-time a teacher for 6 years in the Hudson Valley, and part-time even more than that. But um, so that comes to mind. But I guess I want to start with what you're saying about wilderness versus civilization, because that's something that I've become extremely interested in. And that goes way back. I think living in upstate New York, even right now, I'm looking out on fields bounded by stone walls with hills covered with forest in the distance. And I've always loved that balance
Mm,
between the wild and the uncultivated, and yet the spaces of pasture land.
hmm.
And I love the wilderness. At the same time, I think my favorite scenic places are the places where you see that balance between like the cultivated and the wild all in one kind of in balance. So I think in some ways my interest in the wilderness and civilization goes back to, as far as I can remember, growing up in upstate New York, and I've always loved walks and nature and hikes, and we've even shared a lot of hikes over the years where we've had conversations like this. Um, but the best visual expression, or even I would say maybe even intellectual expression that I know of that whole dialectic between order and civilization and wilderness, on the other hand, is the series of paintings by Thomas Cole, The Course of Empire, which
Wow.
is
Yeah.
some people listening may know he was from the Hudson Valley. So he's experiencing a little bit of a revival right now. There's been some big Thomas Cole exhibits at the Met and other museums, but um, I'll talk a little bit just about the paintings so people know what he's depicting there. It's a series of five huge paintings that he painted in the 1830s in Catskill, New York. And what it depicts is the five paintings tell a story from start to finish of a society, like a little village or city that goes through growth from a collection of, huts in a wilderness to a huge bustling metropolis, and then to the destruction, the fall and the destruction of that metropolis.
Mm-hmm.
So the five paintings tell that, and what's interesting about the paintings is the center painting, which is the third painting out of the five, which is called Consummation. And your eye kind of like instantly skips over the other paintings and goes right to Consummation because it's big, it's flashy. The city at this point has grown from that little collection of huts in a village in the forest to this just gigantic, overwhelming metropolis, that has notably, I think what Cole is trying to show is that it has completely effaced the landscape.
Mm, yeah.
If
Yeah.
you look at the first two paintings, the savage state, he calls the first one because of the primitive rudeness of the inhabitants and the buildings. Then you have the agrarian or the pastoral state where you see this like little town that's emerged, and you see fields being cultivated, and the sky even has gone from what it was in the savage state, which was this like tempestuous black clouds, to now the sky is blue and pleasant. When you get to that third painting, though, that town that had existed in harmony with nature, where you have your little fields, but you still have forest around. You have your temple, you have your houses, you even have some people in the foreground who are dancing and reciting poetry that you can make out. In the third painting, where the city has just completely dominated the landscape, you can't even see, you're hard pressed to find any green underneath the built environment of the city. So the city has replaced
Hmm.
the natural
Yeah.
environment. Now, a lot of people today who interpret the course of empire want to take this in an environmentalist direction,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
is part of what Cole was getting at. But really, I think what he was getting at was much deeper, and it's what
Hmm.
you're talking about here. He was talking about the human tendency to take life, the wild and the uncultivated, and as we begin to direct the things that are growing, the sapling, as we begin to
Mm.
direct it, we start to try to control it
Yeah. Yeah.
and bring it so much within the realm of our rationality and predictability that we end up stifling it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you see in the city. And what ends up happening after that center painting in the Consummation of Empire, you see the seeds of destruction there in the center of chaos, to use the framework you've been using. You see the seeds of chaos reemerging because it's a really subtle little detail, but there's this fountain on the side of the painting. And while all the citizens of the city have turned out to celebrate, there's this big parade going on, and it looks like a triumphal procession. So you see warriors returning, presumably from some successful conquest. You see them processing across this bridge, and like throngs of citizens just like cheering them on and welcoming them back to the city. And then in this little fountain in the corner of the painting, such a little detail that at first you could look at this painting for a long time and not even notice it. You see two little boys playing in this fountain who are fighting over a toy warship.
Nice. Yeah.
And I think what he's suggesting there is that in the midst of this, um, the lavish architecture and the sumptuous decorations and the feasting and the celebration that's happening, what's happened is you see the reemergence of chaos because the bloodlust of the
Hmm.
citizens is beginning to return.
Wow.
And you see it with those two children. And then in the next painting, you see the city in the middle of an invasion, being invaded by some hostile army, and the war taking place all over its streets and bridges, and
Yeah.
flames erupting. And then in the final painting, Desolation, you see the city absolutely destroyed. You see some columns and some foundations sticking up through the vines and the greenery, but what's striking is how little of the city is visible and how nature has returned and conquered. Um, so Cole is absolutely speaking to the same dynamic between chaos and order. And
Wow.
he's speaking on so many levels. I think there is the environmental level. I think there's also the level of the moral and the philosophical, where he's just seeing the tendency of human beings to try to exert their dominance and their control to such an extent over nature that they kill it.
Yeah.
But you can't, as the Roman poet Horace said, you can drive nature out, but she will come back with a pitchfork.
Yeah.
So,
Wow, that's
um,
so interesting. I love that, and it's interesting too how you were talking about how this kind of depiction through art of the pattern of the world, the way that things develop and kind of build upwards and then kind of collapse back down again. That there is this sort of pattern of like in human nature, the desire to take the chaos, to take the unformed potential, the soil, the whatever it is, and to kind of from that to cultivate and to build and to construct and to create order out of that and to kind of build it up. And then there seems to be like a sort of point that gets reached where there is this sort of balance between the two. But there's always like a tension there. There's always like a push and a pull, of this desire to constantly kind of like be building bigger and taller and more and all of that. And then at the same time, the chaotic element that is constantly on the edge, that's wanting to sort of to bring things in there that are alive. A lot of times, the things that get built are structures that contain life, but they're not necessarily alive themselves. It's like you need to have space within the city. You need to have space within the community and the infrastructure and everything else for life actually to happen. And there can be a certain point where things become so built up and so dominant and so controlling that life itself can even begin to become choked out. And so you need to have the interplay of both of those things happening. And if you don't, if you pull things up, if you continue to build things up and you continue to try to control and subdue and all of the rest, like you say, nature returns, the chaotic aspect returns and begins to kind of get in there and bring things down on its own. The other thought that came to mind as you were talking there, which was really interesting, was the point that you pulled out about how in that one particular painting, as you're seeing this happening on the macro level, like where you're seeing this happen on the level of empire or the level of culture, there's this microcosm of the two little boys, right? So like playing down, and they're playing with warships, and I think that it's a wonderful callback to the fact that what we were talking about originally, what we talked about with regard to friendship. It's like what we play out on the micro level in our own lives, in our own relationships, is the same pattern that's being played out in the world at the highest level with culture and with cities and all of those kinds of things. And there's that tension, that same tension is there of like the two little boys playing. And like in friendship, there is always this tension. Like you see kids playing on the playground and whatever it is, and it's like, I want to be it, or I want to be first, or I want to do this, or I want to that was my ball, that's my thing. And you see them playing out civilization on this tiny little level, and there is the growth and the maturity, the growing from little kids that really can't play with one another very well without getting a rock in the eye, or breaking down in tears and having to go call mom or something like this, is that as they grow in maturity, they start to be able to navigate that interplay better, right? Of being able to be like, okay, I need to, there needs to be some structure here. We need to have some structure in order for the game to work. We need to have boundaries and limits, and a space to play in, and all those kinds of things. And we need to have a turn order and all the rest. But there also needs to be freedom. There also needs to
Right.
be space for creative play, for different kinds of personalities. And hey, here's this person that's my friend that we've been playing games together for a while now. We've kind of gotten to know each other a little bit, and I know that there are things that are different about this person. And so I need to know when it is that I need to kind of assert the need for yeah, I don't want to say for control, but for order and stability and those kinds of things. And when we need to give a little bit and say, hey, my way of doing it, even though this is the way that maybe I think brings about the most order, or or the most fun, or whatever it is. That's not the only way of seeing it, and so I need to make space for my friend as well. And so I think it's interesting how even in our relationships and our ability, I think in friendship, friendship teaches us how to navigate the world in that kind of way, and how to resist the temptation either for things to collapse down into anarchy,
Yeah.
to just be like, okay, we're just going to just whatever, like we're just gonna, and there's no rules, I'm invincible, I can just run around, do whatever I want, or on the other hand, to become so controlling that it's like, well, nobody wants to play this game anymore.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, you're reminding me of there's a great book by Anthony Eslin, who's a wonderful linguist and English professor and a Catholic. And he wrote this book, 10 Ways to Destroy Your Child's Imagination, where he's imitating Lewis's screw tape model. So he's writing about how to destroy your children's imagination. And of course, he wants to find ways of fostering the imagination. And he loves Lewis and Tolkien, so he's very much keyed into um, these same things that we're talking about right here. But he laments. I'm thinking of games that we have invented. One of the things that comes to mind when I think of our friendship is all the different games that we've tried
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
devise and perfect and refine over the years. Outdoor games, board games, and even as we got older, ways that we like adjusted them to, keep them interesting, and to keep them something that like even an adult could still um, participate in and enjoy. Um, but Esselin bemoans the loss of the sandlot baseball game, right?
Right.
The
Yeah.
classic American phenomenon in neighborhoods all around the country, poor neighborhoods, richer neighborhoods, where kids would just like get together and spontaneously just like start playing a game. And you might have a tiny little lot that's not even really the right shape, but you make do, and you make that rock first base, and this stump over here is home plate. And what's really remarkable is how resilient kids are at learning, like you were saying, learning to overcome their differences, their disagreements, to figure out who should be the umpire and who should take turns being the umpire next time, and accommodating a field that doesn't have every feature that you might want on a baseball field, and yet making it work in a way that's fun and memorable. And he just talks in the book about how the loss of that um, to kids being on screens does
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
bode well for civilization
Yeah,
for many of the
absolutely.
same reasons that you're suggesting.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a few minutes here if we can, which is, let's think about this. So, what we've been talking about here is we've been talking about how there is this sort of interplay between chaos and order in the world, that there are times when, things can become overly structured, or there are times when things can become overly chaotic, and there's sort of this interplay in the back and forth, and we kind of exist in the in between. It's like, how do we navigate in the in between, or in terms of the seafaring analogy, or in terms of the idea of wilderness and idea of cultivation innovation and so forth. It's like how much space do we make for, like you say, for imagination, for creativity, for those aspects that are more chaotic and unpredictable, and when do we need to have order in the midst of that? So let's think about this just now for a few minutes in terms of where we're at. I think maybe kind of more broadly in terms of Western culture. It seems like we're experiencing a time, you kind of alluded to it a bit here, where we're experiencing we're experiencing some real challenge when it comes to navigating the world. There's a lot of, it just seems like there's a lot of upheaval. There's a lot of that going on right now. There's a lot of waves, you could say, or there's a lot of, like Thomas Cole, in the painting that you referenced, talks about, nature coming back with a pitchfork. It's just, it almost feels like there's a lot of tumultuousness in the world, a lot of difficulty playing together, you might say, right? Like the kids are just not getting along very well right now. And so the kind of question that we might have is, what might be some things that might be contributing to this in our culture today? What might be some of the reasons that we might find for that? And then also, are there any lessons that maybe we've been able to learn from stories or art or even just our own friendship and relationships and life experience that might be able to help us when it comes to how do we get back to that sense of balance? How do we kind of find that place, that sort of magic space where the play happens, right? Where it doesn't have to be, the police on the one end or just total anarchy on the other end. How do we kind of navigate that? Any thoughts there?
Right. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm thinking of, again, experience as an educator and then as a parent. I think the desire for safety is just overwhelming among people right now. We saw this during
Mm,
the COVID pandemic. We see this in a million different ways in our culture right now. And it's not that the world is safe. There's a sense that in the last 50 to 60 years, I think, when I hear my dad talk about growing up in Croton along the Hudson, I'm sure when your dad talks about growing up, it's very common to hear people say, like, oh, our parents wouldn't know where we were the entire day. We'd just be roaming around our town, our city. And as long as we came back in the evening, everything was okay. And I don't think that's just old people being nostalgic. I think there has been a real shift there with how dangerous in terms of violence and sexual violence and all kinds of things. But there's a real danger there, I think, of overreaction.
yeah.
Um, so um, I think there's a larger, what's the term here? I guess sociological issue that we have seen more of a breakdown. We've seen rising rates of violence. We've seen rising rates of dysfunction, most of which come back to the collapse of the family.
Mhm.
Speaking of ships and monasteries, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
an
yeah.
interesting way to consider the family is like a little outpost of order amidst chaos. And talk about, I mean, life. You're bringing life into the world and figuring out how to raise it. But I think the collapse of that, maybe most fundamental of all social institutions, the family, has led to a much darker and more violent world. But I think we've seen this massive overreaction where parents are so concerned about keeping their children safe, at least safe in terms of their bodies. And I think that's an
Yeah,
important
right.
distinction,
Yeah.
that they don't allow them to have the freedom that can that is indispensable for children to not only have an enjoyable upbringing, but to learn a great deal. I mean, I think about some of the games that we used to play. We played this big gun game that you invented in our massive
Yeah.
three-story barn. I'm not
Yeah.
entirely sure that that third story was the floor in that third story was totally safe. No, nobody went up there and inspected it. There was all kinds of rusty old metal lying around in that barn, and yet some of our best memories, I can guarantee you, are going to be the times running and screaming around inside that barn, shooting each other with toy guns.
Yeah,
Um,
that would definitely not have been up to code, I think, that game.
to say the least. Um, and I also think of the growing problem here in New York State with Lyme's disease and ticks, and I have not I haven't personally, I haven't gotten Lyme's disease. I know you have, and it's a horrible, painful thing. But I have seen so many parents at the school I taught at and who I've talked to casually who don't let their kids play outside for fear of them getting Lyme's disease.
Wow.
And I
Yeah.
don't want to trivialize the problem of Lyme's disease, but then on the other hand, a childhood that doesn't involve running around in the
Mm.
woods and at least running the risk of some of those dangers is not a childhood that's going to lead to the kind of memories I think that can nourish a soul over decades
Yeah.
of a
And I
lifetime.
think those memories, like you say too, like not only are they fun and they're just fond memories that we have, but they're formational. Like actually, like when we play, like we are essentially trying out the world. Like we're trying out a means of being in the world, and that's also how friendships get formed in the first place, right? Is when we do this, when we play together, when we kind of create these spaces where we can, try out things. We can try out things sometimes that are a little bit more on the chaotic side, that are a little bit more on the dangerous side, or a little bit more on the order, and having to find the limits and find the boundaries between those. And sometimes the way that you find the edge is by getting hurt, right? Like that's just what happens. Like you get, it's well, okay, not going to do that again, right? But you have to experience it. Like you have to do that. And sometimes I think by trying to police things, even on a child rearing kind of level, or we can even see this on a more widespread governmental level. When we police those things and we don't allow people to find the edge themselves, then it's almost like there becomes like, I don't want to get too Freudian with this here, but almost sort of like there's like a repression that happens. There's kind of like a repressed desire to go to the edge, and it's kind of, I think, back to Thomas Cole here. It's this idea of when we try to impose structure on things too strongly, what ends up happening is we start to actually create the thing that we're trying to defend against. We're
Right.
trying to, like, when we try to make things, like you say, so safe that there's no possible danger. What we actually are kind of doing is we're in some ways like seeding the underlying the underlying kind of milieu for chaos to come kind of bursting back up. And I think that is largely what we've seen in society, today. And it's hard to tell what happens first. Like, is it, the chicken or the egg, right? Is it that there's too much kind of control from the top down that chaos begins to erupt from underneath? Or does it go the other way, where it's like there's so much chaos underneath that there's this need that's felt to impose kind of structure and limits and boundaries, and it becomes this sort of self-perpetuating spiral that kind of tears things down. I think on the positive note, just to flip that for a moment, because I think that is kind of interestingly what we're seeing in our culture today, but to flip it on the positive side is, I think that spiral goes both ways, right? Like you can go up the spiral as well. It can tear things down, and things can erode and go back to the state of of fragmentation, which is what we're seeing. But you can also build it back up, and you can build it up from the ground up. That as we begin to try to instead of as we try to create that kind of balance in our lives, that sort of interplay, whether it's in our friendships or whether it's in our families or whether it's in just in all of the various small ways that we can in our conversations, whatever it is, like just having a conversation like this, and making space for difference, but then also finding the connections and building that kind of order. As we do that, as we say, spirals upward. And as you said, in family, like you're literally creating people, right? Like you're creating individuals, you're forming individuals. And then as those individuals form friendships, that is the basic structural unit for society. Like that then becomes the culture. And so a lot of times I think we kind of look at the culture and we bemoan, like, oh, look at all these things happening and all these sort of like really big macro level types of things, which we don't have a lot of control over or a lot of access to. But what we do have access to is the things that we touch ourselves. You've been
Right.
talking a little bit there about, just even the area where you live in upstate New York, and just connecting with the land and connecting with the community and with the family and all those kinds of things. So maybe kind of as we're sort of bringing this in for a landing here, maybe we could just talk for a couple of minutes of like, are there some are there some practical things that we can do to start to reverse the sort of downward spiral, if you will, if the tendency to kind of, pull things toward this kind of authoritarian sort of order, and the collapse down into chaos on the other end, as we are sort of trying to occupy this middle space? What are some things that we can do, or maybe some things from your own experience that you've found to be helpful in terms of trying to establish that sort of balance, maybe in your own family or in your own community, or just even personally, because these things scale all the way down, but then they also scale all the way back up again. So I don't know, what are maybe some things that you've been finding to be helpful in regards to that?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the hopeful piece of this, right? I think like that painting and Consummation of Empire, I think the last couple decades have shown that after the, not to get too geopolitical, a little example of a larger trend that we see where people are realizing, and I think this crosses partisan lines to some extent, that um, the bureaucracy in our nation is so entrenched. I think both sides of the political aisle, for different reasons, have come to the point where they realize that um, there's not going to be that much we can do to change that. So, what we can change are the places and the people that are right in front of us. So, I think that you're starting to see a recapturing of this idea of like the
Yeah, yeah, I think
local
that's right.
neighborhoods, local communities. And I think one of the things that people should do is really lean into that. I know that we have some friends, mutual friends of ours, who live the next town over, who have done a really great job in the house that they bought 7 or 8 years ago of um, doing something old-fashioned like throwing a block party. They have all
Right.
their neighbors. They're not friends with all of their neighbors, but they try to be. Having all of their neighbors kind of gather in their house occasionally, getting to know their neighbors. That's a risky thing. That's an awkward thing. That's not something that's always very comfortable. And yet, what it leads to is, to use the word that you used before, it's formational.
Yeah.
It's
That's so,
something that not only enables us to help our neighbors and get to know our neighbors, but it's something that enriches our lives by helping us have conversations and relationships that we wouldn't normally have. I think the thing that we have to break above all is this mentality that we have seen social media accelerate of just like siloing and
yes.
compartmentalizing ourselves into
Yeah,
people who think exactly like we do.
exactly.
Because to go back to the beginning of this conversation, um, you can't truly have friendship if you're interacting with people who are exactly like you, temperamentally and philosophically. The nature of friendship is a shared pursuit of virtue, so you've got to have some commonality there. But to have too much commonality means there's nothing to pursue.
Absolutely.
Um, so I think this idea of kind of radical hospitality, um, thinking in these bounded ways about the actual physical area that you live in and the people who live within that small radius around your neighborhood. Who are those people? Can I get to know those people? Are there things I can do to find common cause with these people, even if I might disagree with them on X or Y issues? What can we work together on?
That's
So
so,
I think that's where mine goes for a lot of the hope and the what can be done.
yeah, I love that. That's super, super good. And the thing that comes to mind with that as well is that that can be messy, right? Like it is in a lot of ways. It is sort of, what we've been thinking about here, which is the idea of like being called out upon the water, right? It's like being called out into the space that is uncertain, like you were saying, when you invite your neighbors over and you don't really know them that well, or you're a kid on the playground and there's those kids over there that you don't really know. It's like we have a tendency as human beings, like you say, to silo into these kinds of homogenous bounded groups that don't have that kind of interplay. They don't have that kind of organic back and forth and push and pull and tension, and we need that. And I think that there is, like you say, a restoration of that to some extent. That even as, like we say, the waters maybe seem to be rising in some ways in our culture today, that there's a positive side to that, which is like a return of wildness. That there's a little bit of a sense of a return of wildness, which obviously can be very dangerous and can be very destructive in a lot of ways, but positive also in some ways too. That in a lot of ways, the idea of getting back to the local, the idea of getting back to having your neighbors over, or letting the kids play outside more, or things like that. It's like it is a return to that which is a little bit more akin to the unpredictable and the not as structured, the homegrown, you could say, right? And like you were saying as well,
Well,
just even expressions. Yeah, go
one
ahead.
term that comes up a lot in these kinds of discussions with people who really lean into the localist way of seeing things is viewing something as a given,
Mm.
right? Like something that's just given. Like in our culture, this could maybe be the topic for a whole other podcast discussion, but we are very used in our culture to choice,
Mm.
down to the most foundational levels that we choose our form of government,
Mm.
right? That's one of the glorious prerogatives of American citizens. But that has kind of cascaded down into every area of life where you can't go to a store without having 30 different ketchup brands.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah.
Where we've gone to this extreme on choice when it comes to um, how we choose spouses and how we
Mm.
choose colleges and where we live. And there's almost this like choice fatigue that sets in because there's such an array of choices out there that sometimes it can be refreshing and ennobling and necessary just to think of things in a wildly different perspective and just say, what has been given to me?
Yeah.
Who am I? Not in terms of who I want to create myself to be, but what have I been given? What have I inherited? Where have I been placed? What is the actual neighborhood that I'm in? Sure, I could pull up my stakes and move anywhere. Um, I could theoretically get any kind of job. I could quit my job and get any kind of job tomorrow. But instead of thinking of family and community and job and church and organizations as something where the emphasis is on me and my choice, instead trying to do this mental turn where we think of things as being givens.
Yeah. I
There's
think
certain
that's
things that come to us from nature, or for a
mm,
Christian, we might say from God's providence. But either way, certain things that have been given to us, that have been entrusted to us, that we're supposed to steward and work with. And again, you have that idea of taking nature and not stifling it, but
yeah.
taking what's been given to us in the course of nature and improving it
Mm,
and um, fostering it and helping it to grow and to flourish rather than pushing it down and trying to put such an emphasis on me and my own will
that's
that
so
I
good.
I stifle the things around me that have been given to me.
I love that. Yeah, there's an aspect there of kind of going with the flow a little bit. That's the idea of the ship again, right? That you can't fight every wave. If you fight every wave, you break apart. Like, and that's what we see kind of happening in some ways. That we have to, there has to be a flexibility. You have to be able to turn the sail to the wind. Like you've got to be able to just allow, in some ways, the world to set the course and to have a sense of trust that that is not all bad, right? And
Right.
it kind of goes back to the way of seeing the world is do we see the world as something to struggle against purely? Is it just something that is out to destroy us, or is there a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world that says, well, yeah, there can be danger and there can be casualties and there can be destruction and all of the rest, but there's also something about the world that is for our own good, and that if we allow ourselves to kind of move with that, to roll with the punches, to know when there are times that we do have to actually push against something or break through something, but to also to know and to get to know and understand when are the times that we need to just be open to what is happening. I think that that's really super helpful for us, and so. Well, I think, one of the things I just want to say kind of in closing is, you talked about just, things being a gift and receiving the gifts that are given. And I just want to say that, our friendship in so many ways has been such a gift to me. And I think that even just being able to have these kinds of conversations is a tremendous gift. And so I think it's important that we really don't take those things for granted, that we always take moments to even look at the world with gratitude and say, okay, here are the things that are present to me, that have been given to me. And so I do want to just thank you, very much for being willing to share with us here on the podcast. And I hope that we will get to speak again very soon.
Yeah, thanks. It's been delightful. Appreciate having me. And I would echo those words too, that yeah, no, our friendship has been a huge encouragement. I think I thought immediately of our friendship when I read that letter from Tolkien speaking about Lewis and the encouragement and influence that they were on each other. So appreciate the invite and the chance to talk about this.
So good, so good. And so just to kind of close this out to our listeners here, I would want to just, I want to thank you for listening and for being part of the conversation, and also and just invite you to continue the conversation, in the comments. If there are some thoughts from the episode here today that maybe sparked some thoughts for you, what are some practical ways that maybe you have found to navigate the world in the context of your own community? Are there ways that you've found to maybe engage with those that are around you, even locally? What are some things that you've found that have been helpful in the course of that? And maybe even if you want to reflect a little bit on friendship and how instrumental that has been in your own life. And so I look forward to getting to hear your thoughts in the comments, and I look forward to getting to speak with you again soon in the next episode.